He slid the divorce papers across that long black marble table like he was swatting away a fly. Didn't even look at her. Jae-min Kwon, the man whose name made bankers sweat and rivals disappear, sat at the head of his table surrounded by men with guns under their jackets. And he ended 4 years of marriage the way most people cancel a subscription. Cold, efficient, already done with it before the ink dried. And then the door opened, and she walked in. Yuri Han, beautiful, smiling, taking her place beside him like the seat had always been hers. That's the moment Sienna Vale understood everything. And here's what nobody in that room understood yet. The quiet woman picking up that pen? She didn't just own her dignity. She owned the building they were sitting in. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, stay with me. Because this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel and follow every part of Sienna's story to the end. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the beginning. The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon, not the gentle kind that made Manhattan look cinematic from a distance. This was the stubborn, cold variety that soaked through your coat before you reached the corner and made everything smell like wet concrete and old regret. It drummed against the tall windows of the Kwon estate with a kind of relentless patience, as though it had nowhere else to be and no intention of leaving. Sienna had stood at those windows before, in other seasons, watching the water move across the surface of Long Island Sound, and thinking about nothing in particular. It was one of the few habits she'd kept from her old life, the ability to go quiet inside herself, to let the world run at its own pace without demanding that she keep up with it. 4 years inside this house had tested that habit severely. Tonight, she was dressed simply. Dark slacks, a cream blouse, her dark hair pulled back in the way she wore it when she wasn't trying to impress anyone, which, inside this house, was always. She had learned early in her marriage that trying to impress the Kwon family was like trying to fill a bucket that someone kept poking holes in. You could exhaust yourself and they would still find something wrong with the water. Misu Kwon had made that clear within the first 30 days. Sienna still remembered the older woman's expression at their first formal dinner, that careful, measuring look, the way her eyes traveled from Sienna's shoes to her face and back again without a flicker of warmth. Misuk had said nothing cruel that night. She hadn't needed to. The silence itself was the verdict. Not enough. Not ours. Not worthy. 4 years of that silence, 4 years of knowing that no matter how composed she remained, no matter how quietly she moved through this house and this life, Misuk's verdict never changed. The woman had spent Sienna's entire marriage waiting for the moment she could enforce it. Tonight, apparently, that moment had arrived. Sienna walked down the main staircase at 8 minutes past 7. She could hear the low murmur of male voices from behind the dining room doors. Too controlled to be casual, too deliberate to be comfortable. She recognized the sound. She had spent 4 years learning to recognize sounds in this house, the way a person learned to read weather. That particular sound meant something had already been decided. She opened the dining room doors herself. Nobody offered to open them for her. There were 11 men at the table. She recognized most of them. Senior figures from Jae-min's various enterprises, men who nodded at her in corridors and never quite met her eyes. They were positioned along the sides of the table with the careful arrangement of people who had been told exactly where to sit and why. At the far end, in the high-backed chair that Sienna privately thought of as his throne, sat her husband. Jae-min Kwon looked exactly as he always looked in these moments, controlled, still. The kind of stillness that wasn't peace but its opposite. The stillness of something coiled, something that had learned how to contain itself in public and save the rest for later. He was wearing the charcoal suit she had watched him choose that morning without knowing what he'd chosen it for. She realized now that he'd known then. He'd known all day. Sienna sat down at the opposite end of the table, 12 chairs of empty space between them and 11 men who were pretending not to watch her face. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Jae-min looked at her, really looked at her, directly, in that way he had, the way that used to feel like recognition and somewhere in the middle years had started feeling like evaluation. He slid the papers down the center of the table. They moved across the marble slowly, finding their own path in the way flat objects do on smooth surfaces, and came to rest a few inches from Sienna's hands. She didn't pick them up immediately. She looked at them. White pages. dense text, a ribbon marker indicating where she was supposed to sign. She already understood what they were. She wasn't surprised. Some part of her, the part that had been quietly doing the math for longer than she'd admitted to herself, had known this was coming. The signs had been accumulating for months like water behind a dam. The late absences that stopped being explained. The phone calls taken in other rooms. The particular quality of distance that settles between two people when one of them has already made a decision and is simply managing the timing. What surprised her was the audience. "You called your captains to watch this," Sienna said. Her voice was quiet, not shaking. She had worked hard, over many years, to keep her voice from shaking in rooms where it wanted to. "They're here for a business meeting," Jae-min said. "This is a formality." "A formality. The lawyers have reviewed everything. It's straightforward." Sienna finally picked up the papers. She turned the pages slowly. Not because she was reading them carefully, though she was reading them carefully, but because she refused to perform the reaction that everyone in this room was waiting for. She could feel it, the held breath quality of the air. 11 men waiting to see if the quiet wife would cry, would rage, would beg. Mi-suk wasn't at the table. That was interesting. Mi-suk's absence from a moment this significant meant she considered it already finished. She was somewhere else in the house, Sienna suspected, doing exactly what she always did when she'd won, waiting serenely for the confirmation to reach her. Sienna turned another page. The settlement terms were technically generous. A figure that would have been meaningful to the woman Jae-min believed she was. The Westchester apartment they'd rarely used. A vehicle. Monthly payments for a specified term. It was the kind of settlement a man offers when he wants to feel like he did right by someone on his way out. Sienna set the papers down. She reached for the pen that had been placed beside her water glass, as though it had all been prepared in advance, which of course it had, and she looked down the length of the table at her husband. "You brought your people here because you thought I would make this difficult," she said. Jae-min was quiet for a moment. The smallest hesitation. "I brought them here because this meeting overlapped with Jae-min." He stopped. "Don't," she said. Not angrily, just with a kind of finality that filled the word completely. She signed her name, clear and unhurried. The same signature she'd been using since she was 19 years old and had first been handed documents she was told would matter. She put the pen down. "I'll take my 2 suitcases," she said. "I don't want the apartment. I don't want the car. I don't want the monthly payments." The room shifted. She felt it without looking at anyone but Jae-min. The subtle change in the quality of the silence, the way certain men glanced at each other without moving their heads. Jae-min studied her. "The settlement is fair." "I'm sure it is." "You're walking away with nothing." Sienna took one breath. Just one. "No," she said. "I'm leaving with everything that was always mine." She stood. And then the doors opened. Sienna heard them before she turned. The particular sound of heavy doors parting, the way the air pressure in the room changed. She turned, and there was Yuri Han, moving through the entrance the way a person moves through a space they have already claimed in their mind, dressed in a dark fitted dress with her hair down, and an expression that was working very hard to look like something other than triumph. She crossed the room and took the empty chair directly to Jae-min's right. Nobody at the table looked surprised. Sienna understood then that the audience hadn't been assembled for the divorce papers. It had been assembled for this. For Yuri's entrance. For the image of her taking that chair. Because image was the language Jae-min Kwon had always spoken most fluently, and this was his statement, the punctuation at the end of 4 years. Sienna looked at Yuri for exactly 3 seconds, not with hatred, something more complicated and colder than hatred, the look of someone cataloging information. Then she picked up her signed copy of the divorce papers, folded it once, and put it in her jacket pocket. She walked toward the doors. Behind her, Jae-min's voice followed her. "You're really leaving without a fight." She stopped. She didn't turn around. "I already won my fight," she said. 4 years ago." She left the room. The 2 suitcases had been packed for days. She knew that now, or she'd known it in the way that part of the mind that watches quietly knows things before the rest of you is ready to hear them. They were sitting in the small study adjacent to the bedroom she had occupied for the last 18 months. Not the main bedroom. That boundary had shifted somewhere in year 3, gradually, the way all significant shifts happen, not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small practical decisions that add up to a rearrangement of life. She zipped the second case closed and stood in that room for one moment, looking at it. The furnishings were beautiful. They had always been beautiful. Misuk had chosen everything in this house with an eye for quality that Sienna had genuinely respected, even when she'd felt the selection was partly designed to make her feel like a visitor in her own home. The art on the walls, the linens, the particular way light moved through these rooms in the early morning. Sienna had never felt like this was hers. She'd never quite let herself. She carried the cases out herself. She didn't call anyone. She didn't need anyone to carry 2 suitcases. The main staircase was quiet. The dining room doors were still closed. She could hear voices inside, lower now, the after-business register of men who have concluded what they came to conclude and are moving into the social portion of the evening. Sienna reached the front entrance. A member of the household staff, a young woman named Clara, who had always been careful and kind to Sienna in the particular way of people who have correctly assessed a power dynamic and decided basic decency was worth the private risk, was standing near the door. She looked at the suitcases. She looked at Sienna's face. "Mrs. Kwon." "It's all right," Sienna said. "Is there anything—" "You've been very kind," Sienna said. "In this house, that has meant a great deal." Clara's face did something complicated. She nodded once, tightly, and stepped back. Sienna opened the front door herself. The rain was still falling. The grounds of the estate spread out in front of her, dark and wet, the gravel driveway glistening under the exterior lights. The iron gates at the far end were closed against the night, and beyond them, lined up along the service road in a formation that suggested careful advance planning, were 7 black vehicles. She stood at the top of the steps looking at them. Then she descended. The lead car's rear door opened before she reached it. Inside, a man named Daniel Park, 44 years old, immaculate in a dark suit, her chief of staff for the past 11 years, was waiting with a phone already extended in one hand and a tablet in the other. "Mrs. Vale Kessler," he said, which was what he always called her when they weren't managing the performance. Sienna put her cases in the car, settled into the seat, and pulled the door closed behind her. Through the tinted glass, the lights of the Kwon estate receded as the convoy began to move. She looked at the phone in Daniel's hand, then at the tablet, then out the window. "How long since anyone inside has reviewed the covenant documentation?" "Their internal legal team flagged some concerns 8 months ago," Daniel said. "They didn't pursue them." "They wouldn't. The auditors finished their preliminary pass this afternoon. The violations are comprehensive." Sienna absorbed this. The leverage positions? Intact, all of them. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the gates of the estate passed behind them. The convoy accelerated onto the main road, heading toward the bridge, heading toward the city. 3 years ago, she said, not really to Daniel, mostly thinking aloud. When the internal power struggle almost took everything he had built, I made a choice. "You did." "I chose to protect him, quietly, without his knowledge." She paused. "Because I loved him, and I believed the organization could be what he said it was going to become." Daniel said nothing. He had the gift of knowing when his employer was not asking for a response. "He violated those covenants deliberately," Sienna continued. "Not through negligence, deliberately, which means somewhere in the last 3 years, the man I was protecting decided that the protections didn't apply to him." She finally took the phone from Daniel's hand. "Wake the Empire," she said into it. What happened in the next 6 hours was the kind of thing that tends to get described afterward in quiet rooms by people who were present as the night everything moved at once. Across Manhattan, accounts that had been held in structured dormancy began activating. Not slowly, not with the hesitation of bureaucratic process, but with the particular speed of systems that have been precisely calibrated for exactly this contingency and were simply waiting for authorization. Board members received calls. Not from assistants, from the individuals themselves, attorneys with names that other attorneys recognized, executives whose appearances on a caller ID produced an immediate quality of attention. Legal teams who had held sealed documentation in escrow for 3 years received the instruction to break those seals. And the thing that Jae-min Kwon didn't know about his wife, the thing he'd never had reason to suspect because she had constructed the architecture of her financial life, with extraordinary care specifically so that nobody in his world would stumble across it, began slowly to become visible. Before there was a Sienna Kwon, there had been a Sienna Vale Kessler, the only heir to Richard Vale Kessler, whose financial dynasty had operated in the upper register of international capital for 40 years, with the deliberate obscurity of an organization that preferred results to recognition. Richard had built Axiom Crown Holdings, not to be famous, but to be effective, a multi-billion-dollar international conglomerate structured across holding companies and strategic partnerships in a way that made it simultaneously everywhere and nowhere obvious. When Richard died, Sienna had been 26, and she had inherited everything, not some of it, not a managed portion, everything, controlling interest, voting rights, the complete architecture of what her father had spent a lifetime building. She had also inherited the weight of it. The board had expected her to step fully into the chairman's seat immediately. Some of the senior partners had expected her to fail gracefully and allow them to steer. What nobody had expected was for Sienna Vale Kessler to quietly, efficiently, and without drama run Axiom Crown through 3 years of market instability in a way that expanded it. And then she had disappeared from elite society. Not dramatically, not with a spectacle. She had simply begun conducting her business with extraordinary privacy, appeared at fewer and fewer social events, and then stopped appearing at any. The story that circulated, and she had been careful about which story circulated, was that she had stepped back to manage a health matter. The truth was simpler and harder to explain. She had fallen in love with a man who didn't know who she was. She had met Jae-min at a gallery opening that she'd attended as a favor to a friend, under a name that was technically hers, but that his world had no reason to know. He had walked into that room and looked at a painting, not at the crowd, not at the networking opportunity, but genuinely at the painting, for 4 uninterrupted minutes before speaking to anyone. She had watched him do that and thought, there's a person inside the reputation. She'd been partly right. That was the thing she would spend years sorting out. She hadn't been entirely wrong about him, about the qualities she'd seen across that gallery. She had simply not anticipated how thoroughly power would eat it. They had dated for 7 months before she told him almost nothing about her actual life, and he hadn't pushed, and she had taken that restraint as evidence of respect. Later she would understand that he hadn't asked because he hadn't felt he needed to. He was Jae-min Kwon. The background of the woman beside him was not the primary subject of his attention. She had married him, loving him. That was the honest, uncomfortable truth that she carried through everything that followed. She hadn't married him as strategy. She hadn't married him as cover or curiosity or an experiment in ordinary life. She had loved him, the real him, the version that existed underneath the reputation and the captains and the black marble table. And she had wanted to protect that. And then 3 years into the marriage, his organization had nearly collapsed. An internal power struggle among his senior people, 2 factions, each believing the other had been skimming, both of them partly right, had threatened to pull down every legitimate business structure that gave Jae-min's world its respectable public face. The criminal enterprise could survive scandal. The legitimate businesses could not survive the kind of financial exposure that was materializing. Sienna had watched from the inside. She had watched Jae-min spend 3 weeks not sleeping, working the phones at 3 in the morning, managing the crisis with the specific controlled desperation of someone who knows they are losing ground and refuses to say so out loud. She had made the decision without telling anyone except Daniel. Through a series of intermediaries, through a holding structure that took 3 weeks to construct to her satisfaction, Axiom Crown had provided emergency financing to the legitimate businesses. Hundreds of millions secured against specific corporate assets. The terms were documented. The covenants were explicit. And the beneficial owner of the lending entity was buried under 3 layers of structured corporate obscurity. The financing arrived. The businesses stabilized. The crisis passed. And Jae-min Kwon had rebuilt his reputation on the foundation of that mystery capital, never knowing whose hands had placed it there. Sienna had watched him accept credit for the recovery at a private dinner with his captains 6 months later. He had spoken about resourcefulness, about the loyalty of certain business relationships, about the qualities that separated men who endured from men who didn't. She had sat beside him and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment called for. She had kept loving him for another year before she finally acknowledged, in a conversation she only had with herself at 4 in the morning in that small study adjacent to the bedroom, that the man she had loved in the gallery had been mostly consumed by the one sitting at the black marble table. The violation of the covenants had been her confirmation. She had found out from Daniel, who had found out from a forensic accountant, Sienna, kept on permanent retainer for exactly this kind of monitoring. Members of Jae-min's inner circle, with his knowledge, the audit strongly suggested, had been moving money from the legitimate businesses into private structures. The companies whose financial health she had guaranteed were being slowly hollowed out by the people she had effectively rescued. That was the moment she had begun preparing. Not with rage, not with the kind of hot, reactive planning that leads to mistakes. With the cool, careful patience she had learned from her father and practiced for 30 years, she had prepared for 4 months before the divorce papers appeared on that marble table. The irony was that he thought he was ending something. He was, in fact, completing it. The convoy crossed the bridge into the city at 11:43. The rain was lighter here, or maybe the building simply made it seem that way, narrowed by all those vertical surfaces into something less overwhelming. Daniel had spent the ride sending confirmations and receiving them, his thumbs moving across the tablet with the efficiency of a man who has spent 11 years managing things his employer decided needed managing. "The credit facilities," Sienna said, "ready to freeze on your authorization." "Not tonight." Daniel looked up. "I want him to have the weekend," she said. "I want him to have Saturday and Sunday of not knowing what's coming. I want him to attend whatever he has planned, shake hands with whoever he needs to shake hands with, believe that the divorce was the ending of something contained." She looked out at the city. Manhattan was doing what Manhattan always did at night, burning with its own light, like it had its own opinion about the dark, and had decided not to honor it. "Monday morning," she said, "when his offices are open and his people are in their seats, and the week is beginning the way the week always begins." Understood. And the message to Axiom Crown's communication team, drafted and ready. "I want it precise," she said. "I don't want drama. I don't want language that sounds like retaliation. I want it to sound like what it actually is. A routine business action triggered by covenant violations that their legal team was already aware of." "Because that's what it is," Daniel said. "Because that's what it is," she agreed. They pulled up to the building that served as Axiom Crown's New York base of operations, a building that appeared on no public documentation connecting it to Axiom Crown, a building that Jae-min had passed perhaps dozens of times without any reason to look at it differently from the others. Sienna stepped out of the car into the light rain. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her cases being handled behind her, and looked up at the building's face. Dark glass and steel, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what ran inside it. She felt something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief, but existed in the territory between them. The specific feeling of a decision fully made, of a door closed not in anger but in clarity. She'd spent 4 years being quiet in someone else's house. Tomorrow she would be quiet in her own building, in her own rooms, and the quiet would be entirely different in character. She went inside. The lobby was lit and empty except for 2 members of her security team and a woman at the front desk who looked up and said nothing because nothing was required, who looked up and simply met Sienna's eyes with the calm acknowledgement of someone who had been waiting for the return of a person they worked for and respected and had wondered about. Sienna crossed the lobby. She took the elevator up. And in the offices above Manhattan, behind doors that nobody in Jae-min Kwon's world knew to look for, the dormant apparatus of Axiom Crown Holdings was already, quietly, beginning to wake. The first thing Sienna did when she reached the 14th floor was take off her shoes. Not dramatically, not as a statement. She simply reached down in the elevator hallway, unstrapped the heels she'd been wearing since that afternoon, and carried them in one hand the rest of the way to her private office. Her feet on the carpet. Real floor. Her floor. Daniel was already at the workstation outside her office door, his jacket draped over the chair back, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He'd beaten her up here by some combination of a service elevator and the particular efficiency that came from 11 years of anticipating what came next. "The preliminary audit summary is on your desk," he said without looking up. "Hard copy. I didn't want it on any network device tonight." Sienna pushed open her office door. The room was exactly as she'd left it 4 months ago when she'd last been here in person. Clean, spare, a desk that faced the window rather than the door, two chairs that were functional rather than impressive, and on the credenza behind the desk, a photograph of her father that she'd never moved from this room to the estate because this was the room where it belonged. She sat down. She put her shoes on the floor beside the chair. She picked up the audit summary. It was 43 pages. She read every page. It took her an hour and 11 minutes, and she did not stop once, did not reach for the water glass Daniel had placed on the corner of the desk, did not look out the window at the city moving below her. When she finished, she set the papers down and sat very still for a moment. Then she said, to the open doorway, "Daniel." He appeared immediately. How many people inside Jae-min's legitimate operations knew about the covenant violations? Based on the audit, the CFO of Kwon International almost certainly knew. The two directors managing the credit lines definitely knew. Whether Jae-min personally authorized the specific transactions or simply, he knew, Sienna said. Daniel paused. He knew, she said again. Not with heat, with the flatness of someone stating a mathematical fact. Jae-min does not operate an organization where his CFO makes $100 million structural decisions without authorization. That's not how he built what he built. The audit can't confirm his direct involvement without... I'm not talking about what the audit can confirm in a courtroom, Daniel. I'm talking about what I know about the man I was married to for 4 years. She finally picked up the water glass. He knew. Which means this wasn't negligence, it was calculation. Daniel was quiet. He calculated that whoever had extended that emergency financing 3 years ago would either not notice or would not be in a position to act. She drank, put the glass down. He calculated wrong on both counts. What do you want to do with the CFO information? Nothing tonight. We let Monday arrive on its own schedule. She stood, which was the signal she used when a conversation was concluded. I want the full restructuring team briefed first thing Sunday evening, not Monday morning, Sunday evening, before anyone in his organization starts their week. I'll arrange it. And I want security on this floor doubled through next week, not because I think he'll do anything stupid, because I want the people working in this building to feel that someone is thinking about their safety while this moves. Done. She looked at the photograph of her father. Richard Vale Kessler had been a man of very few dramatic gestures and very specific language. He'd once told Sienna, when she was perhaps 17 and furious about some injustice she could no longer remember the specifics of, that the most effective response to being underestimated was never anger. Anger was information that you gave to people for free. Patience was information that you kept. She had kept a great deal of information for a very long time. Get some sleep, she told Daniel. Monday is going to require everyone at full capacity. He nodded and withdrew. Sienna stayed in her office until 3 in the morning, not working. The work was already done, the machinery already moving, but simply sitting in the quiet of a room that had always been hers, letting the strange, specific silence of a decision fully made settle around her like weather. Saturday arrived gray and damp. In the Kwon estate on Long Island Sound, the morning moved differently. Jae-min was awake by 6, which was not unusual. What was unusual was that he woke without the immediate purposeful orientation that normally characterized his mornings. That quality he'd always had of sitting up and being immediately present in the day, already calculating, already positioned. This morning he sat at the edge of the bed for almost 4 minutes, which for him was an eternity, looking at the wall. Yuri was not there. She'd returned to her own apartment the previous night, which had been her preference and, if he was being honest, his as well. The dinner had ended late. The men had stayed longer than anticipated. There had been drinking and the specific loud camaraderie that follows a decision that everyone is pretending is less complicated than it is. Jae-min had drunk less than anyone assumed. He kept thinking about the way Sienna had said, "I already won my fight," 4 years ago. He didn't know what that meant. He'd been turning it over since she said it. The way you turn over a stone you found in an unexpected place, not quite sure why you're examining it, just certain there's something under it you haven't seen yet. He went downstairs. Mi-suk was already in the breakfast room, seated at the smaller table she preferred to the formal dining room, her tea in front of her and the newspaper folded beside it, despite the fact that she primarily consumed news through her phone. The newspaper was a habit she'd maintained since Jae-min's father died, a kind of anchor to the structure of days she'd constructed for herself. She looked up when he entered. "Eat something," she said. "I'm not hungry." "Eat something anyway." There are things to discuss. He sat down. A member of the household staff appeared with coffee, which was the only thing he'd accept this early. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at his mother. Mi-suk had always been a woman who wore her victories quietly. She didn't gloat, she found gloating vulgar, and had said so many times. But there was a quality in her posture this morning, a specific alignment of her shoulders and the set of her jaw, that told Jae-min she considered last night a resolution. "The girl took nothing," Mi-suk said. "I'm aware." Which is either very stupid or very... Mother. I'm simply observing that I said enough. He set his coffee cup down harder than he intended. The sound was loud in the quiet room. Mi-suk's eyes moved to the cup and back to his face, and in that movement was 40 years of their dynamic compressed into 2 seconds. The mother who had survived a great deal, and the son who had been shaped by surviving alongside her. "Something about last night bothers you," she said. "Nothing about last night bothers me." Mi-suk regarded him. She was 63 years old and had been reading her son's face since he was born, and she was not persuaded by his answer. But she was also, at her core, a pragmatist. She didn't push when pushing would produce friction rather than information. "Yuri is appropriate," she said, returning to the newspaper. "She understands your world. You've mentioned that. I'll mention it again until it seems like you believe it." He drank his coffee. Through the breakfast room window, he could see the grounds. Wet grass, the gray water of the sound beyond the fence line, the boat dock where he hadn't stood in over a year. He had owned this property for 9 years, and in the first years had sometimes walked the grounds early in the morning with a coffee, alone, before the day's machinery started turning. Sienna had sometimes walked with him. They hadn't talked much on those walks. That had been one of the things he'd valued, her ability to be beside him without requiring anything from him at 7 in the morning. He pushed the thought away. That kind of thinking was indulgent, and he had always hated indulgence. "I have meetings in the city Tuesday," he said. "The expansion timeline needs reviewing." "The financing? In place." "Good." But something moved across his face when he said it. A flicker of something that wasn't quite confidence, that Mi-suk caught and filed without comment. By Sunday afternoon, Yuri Han was becoming a problem of a different kind. Not because she'd done anything wrong, technically. She'd done everything right. She'd been patient through the months of positioning, had played her role in the estate dinner with the exact calibration Jae-min had asked for, had given him the image he needed, and asked for nothing complicated in return. The problem was what she started asking for on Sunday. She called him at 2 in the afternoon. He was in his study, reviewing documents related to the expansion, the clubs, the new territory arrangements, the financial structures that were supposed to formalize by the end of the quarter. "I need to know what the timeline looks like," she said. "For what?" For us, Jae-min. For what comes next." He put down the document he was holding. "We talked about this. We talked about before Friday. This is after Friday. The timeline is the same as it's always been." A pause on her end. He could hear her breathing, that particular shallow quality that preceded what she was actually trying to say. "Mi-suk called me this morning," Yuri said. He went very still. "What did she want?" "She wanted to know my intentions." "She had no business calling you." "She's your mother, Jae-min. She's going to have opinions about—" "I will handle my mother." He heard the edge in his own voice and made a deliberate effort to move past it. "Yuri, nothing has changed. The path is the same." "Is it?" "Why wouldn't it be?" "Because you've been strange since Friday night, and I want to know if that has anything to do with her." The her hung in the air between them, the specific pronoun that didn't need a name attached to it. "It has nothing to do with Sienna," he said. "Then what is it?" He didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind, and Yuri was smart enough to hear it. "I'll call you tonight," he said. "I have work to finish." He ended the call. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, and then he set it face down on the desk and looked at the document he'd been reading before the call. The numbers on the page were the same numbers they'd been 5 minutes ago. Everything was the same. He picked up the document again. He put it down again. "I'm leaving with everything that was always mine." What did she own? The thought arrived uninvited, as it had several times since Friday. He knew, roughly, what she came from. She'd been vague about her background when they met. which he'd attributed to a kind of privacy he'd found appealing after years of women who performed their credentials loudly. He'd gathered that there was family money, some inheritance. He'd never asked for details because it hadn't seemed important. What Sienna brought to their marriage was not financial. She had brought herself, and that had been enough. And then somewhere it had stopped being enough. And he was not in the habit of examining that progression too carefully. But I'm leaving with everything that was always mine, was the sentence of a person who owned something specific. He reached for his phone, found the contact for Lim Soo-han, his most reliable private investigator, the man who moved through information the way water moves through rock, patiently, completely. He stared at the contact, then he put the phone down again. Because some part of him, the part that had been sitting at the edge of the bed at 6 in the morning looking at a wall, knew that making that call was not the action of a man who was certain. And Jae-min Kwon, above all things, had always needed to feel certain. Monday began the way Sienna had designed it to. At 7:52 in the morning, 3 separate banks received formal notices from Axiom Crown's legal representatives informing them that the credit facilities extended to Kwon International's legitimate business entities were being frozen pending a covenant compliance review. At 8:15, those banks began making calls. The first person inside Jae-min's organization to know was Thomas Bay, the CFO of Kwon International. The same Thomas Bay, whose name appeared 17 times in the forensic audit's most damaging sections. He received a call from the primary bank at 8:16, and the account of what happened next was relayed later by his assistant, who had been in the outer office and heard everything through a wall that was not as thick as Thomas apparently believed. He said, to no one in particular, the word "no" 3 times. Then he said a name that his assistant didn't recognize. Then he picked up his desk phone and called Jae-min. Jae-min was in the car on his way into the city. He had a 10 o'clock meeting about the expansion that had been on the calendar for 6 weeks. He was dressed for the meeting, the dark navy suit he wore when he wanted to project authority without aggression, the subtle signal of a man who had already won and knew it. His phone connected through the car's system. "Thomas, we have a problem." Thomas Bay's voice had a quality Jae-min had never heard in it before, a thinness, like cloth with too much stress applied to a single thread. "The credit facilities are frozen." Silence in the car. "Which ones?" "All of them, the full structure. Every facility attached to the legitimate operations. We received formal notice from 3 banks simultaneously, a covenant compliance review triggered by. The notice identifies the beneficial party as Axiom Crown Holdings." Silence again, longer this time. "Jae-min, did you hear?" "I heard you." His voice was level. The driver, who was experienced and had been with him for 7 years, kept his eyes on the traffic ahead with the professional absence of someone who understands that certain information is not his to carry. "Pull the corporate files on Axiom Crown." "I'm already looking. The corporate structure is extensive. Multiple holding layers. I can't find a beneficial owner in the public filings." "There's always a beneficial owner." "I know, but this is Thomas." Something in the tone, a compression. "The covenant violations, the ones we discussed last March." Silence on the other end. "Thomas, the review would..." "Yes, the transactions we structured would technically constitute a violation of the original financing covenants. Technically. The legal team advised that the risk of the lending party identifying and acting on the violations was... The legal team advised wrong." Jae-min pressed 2 fingers against his mouth briefly, a gesture he made sometimes when he was thinking fast and didn't want the thinking to be visible on his face. The gesture was invisible to everyone in the car, except perhaps to himself. "Call Axiom Crown's listed representatives. Arrange a meeting, this week. They've already indicated their CEO intends to come personally." "Fine, arrange it." "Jae-min, arrange the meeting, Thomas." He disconnected. The car moved through morning traffic. Outside, the city was doing its Monday thing, the specific energy of people who've spent the weekend gathering themselves for the week's demands, pouring that gathered energy into intersections and sidewalks and coffee cups carried in a hurry. Jae-min watched the city without seeing it. Axiom Crown Holdings. He turned the name over. He'd heard it, distantly, the way you hear names in peripheral financial conversations. A company that moved in spaces adjacent to his legitimate operations without ever being directly relevant. Large. Private. quiet in the way that very large, very old money tends to be quiet. He'd never had reason to look directly at it. He had an instinct sitting in that car on that Monday morning that felt less like intuition and more like the specific dread of a man who has touched something and felt it move. He pulled out his phone, called Lim Soo-han. "I need a full background on Axiom Crown Holdings," he said when Soo-han answered. "Beneficial ownership, corporate history. Everything visible and everything that isn't. I need it before end of day." "That kind of depth takes end of day, Soo-han." He hung up. The call came at 2:17 in the afternoon. Jae-min was in his corporate offices by then, the 26th floor of a midtown building that bore the Kwon International name on its lobby directory in clean silver letters. He'd spent the morning managing the surface of his day, while the thing beneath the surface moved with increasing speed. 2 more bank contacts by 10:30, his head of operations appearing in the doorway at 11 with an expression that suggested the man was trying to calculate how much to say and how quickly. 3 separate business partners calling to touch base in the specific way that people call to touch base when they've heard something and want to know if it's true. Jae-min had managed all of it with the surface composure that was his greatest professional skill. "Yes, a routine compliance review." "No, nothing to be concerned about. The organizations have been in dialogue. Everything is proceeding normally." He said these things and believed approximately none of them. At 2:15, his assistant, Min Jung, 12 years with him, unflappable in the way of someone who had seen a great deal and sorted most of it into the category of things that resolved themselves, appeared at his office door. "The call you've been expecting from Axiom Crown's legal team," she said. "Put it through." The voice on the line was professionally courteous and completely without warmth in the way of attorneys who are paid to be one and have decided to dispense with performing the other. "Mr. Kwon, I'm calling on behalf of Axiom Crown Holdings to confirm receipt of your request for a meeting. Our CEO has reviewed the request and confirmed availability for Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, at your corporate offices." Thursday works. "Our CEO will be accompanied by legal counsel and a financial review team. We'd ask that you have your CFO and relevant legal representatives available as well." "Understood." A brief pause, just long enough to be deliberate. "Mr. Kwon, our CEO wanted me to convey one additional item." "Go ahead." "She said to tell you," another pause, shorter, "that she'll see you soon." He heard the pronoun, she. Min Jung was still in the doorway. She saw something happen to Jae-min's face that she would later, to a friend she trusted completely, describe only as a door closing behind a person who realizes the lock has changed. "Thank you," Jae-min said into the phone. "Thursday." He ended the call. He sat very still. Min Jung, who had worked for this man for 12 years and had seen him absorb bad news with the equanimity of someone who had been trained since birth to treat pressure as information rather than threat, watched him sit still for 6 seconds, then 7, then 10. "Min Jung," he said. "Yes." "Clear Thursday morning." "Already done." "And pull every piece of corporate documentation we have on Axiom Crown Holdings. Not what the legal team has, everything we have. Every contract, every filing, every communication." "I'll have it within the hour." She left. Jae-min stood. He walked to the window, 26 floors above Midtown Manhattan, spreading in every direction with its characteristic indifference to the scale of individual human crises. He'd stood at this window hundreds of times and found it useful for thinking. The view was large enough to make most problems feel proportionate. It wasn't working today. "She'll see you soon." He reached for his phone, called Soo-han. "Tell me what you have." "I'm not finished." "Tell me what you have right now." He heard Soo-han take a breath, then the sound of papers. Axiom Crown Holdings, parent company established 41 years ago by a Richard Vale Kessler, American financier, deceased. Controlling interest passed to sole surviving heir upon his death 8 years ago. Jae-min's hand tightened on the phone. "The heir's name," he said. Soo-han said it. The name landed in the room like something physical. Sienna Vale Kessler. He didn't say anything. He couldn't for a moment locate the architecture of a sentence. "Jae-min?" Soo-han's voice was careful, in the way of a man who has delivered information before and learned to read the silences that follow. "You want me to continue?" "The emergency financing," Jae-min said. His voice was very quiet. 3 years ago." The investment group that came in when the legitimate businesses were. I'm looking at the corporate structure now. A pause. Longer. Yes. The lending entity is. It traces back. Yes. It's Axiom Crown. He closed his eyes. 3 years. He'd spent 3 years believing in his own recovery, believing that his judgment had navigated a crisis, that his reputation had held, that the right relationships had materialized at the right moment, because that was what happened when you were the kind of man who had built what he'd built. He'd sat at that private dinner and talked about resourcefulness. He'd believed every word. His wife had written the check. His quiet background wife, the one Mi-suk had dismissed for 4 years as insufficient, the one he'd handed divorce papers to in front of his captains because he'd thought the audience would make it easier, had spent 3 years propping up his empire from underneath it. And then he'd violated her trust in the process. And now she was coming Thursday. He opened his eyes. The city was still there, still indifferent, still enormous. He looked at it and felt something that he had not felt in a very long time. Not fear exactly. He had trained himself out of fear the way you train yourself out of a physical habit. Something more precise than fear. The specific sensation of standing on ground that you believed was solid and feeling it shift under your feet. He called Thomas Bay. Thomas answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. You knew, Jae-min said. Jae-min, the identity of the beneficial owner of Axiom Crown. You ran the corporate structures when we took the financing. You're the CFO. You saw the layers. I didn't have confirmation. Thomas. A long pause. I had a strong suspicion, Thomas said. Quietly. Like a man putting something down that he'd been carrying at arm's length. About 18 months ago, when I looked at the covenant structure more carefully, the way certain provisions were written, they were personal in a way that standard financing covenants usually aren't. I thought. He stopped. You thought what? I thought it might be her. I didn't know how to tell you. So you said nothing. I said nothing. Jae-min closed his eyes again. And the violations, the transactions we structured. I believed the exposure was limited. You believed wrong. Yes. He ended the call. He stood at that window for a long time. Then he called Mi-suk. She answered immediately. Jae-min, how was your... When Sienna and I were first married, he said, interrupting her for one of the very few times in his adult life. You told me she was no one. You told me she had nothing to bring to this family except herself. Mi-suk paused. I expressed concerns about, where did you form that assessment? Who did you speak to? Who told you she had no financial background? Silence. I conducted my own research, Mi-suk said carefully. What research? I had her looked into. By who? By people I trusted. A shift in her tone. The defensiveness that preceded a woman who knew she was about to have to account for something. The reports I received indicated she had modest family means, a small inheritance, nothing of consequence. The reports were wrong. Jae-min, what has happened? The woman you dismissed for 4 years, mother, his voice cracked on something that wasn't quite a laugh, owns the building we work in. Silence from Mi-suk's end. Complete silence, which was its own kind of answer. She's coming Thursday, Jae-min said, as the CEO of the company that holds the debt secured against every legitimate asset we have. He heard his mother exhale. Just once. A sound he hadn't heard from her since his father's funeral. What do we... I'll handle it. He turned away from the window. His office felt different than it had this morning. The desk, the furniture, the silver nameplate on the door. All of it slightly altered, the way a room looks after you've understood something in it that you couldn't see before. I'll handle Thursday. And Yuri? Don't call Yuri again, he said. Don't speak to her about any of this. Don't speak to anyone about any of this. He could hear his mother processing, recalibrating, doing the things she'd always been able to do. Reorganize rapidly around a new reality without allowing the reorganization to show. All right, she said. He hung up and sat down at his desk in the sudden silence of a man who had built an empire on the assumption that he understood the ground beneath it and had just discovered that the ground had always belonged to someone, the ground had always belonged to someone else. He sat with that sentence for a long time after the call ended. Not thinking around it, not organizing it into something more manageable, just sitting with the full weight of it, the way you sit with a physical injury before the shock wears off, and the pain arrives properly. His coffee had gone cold. He hadn't touched it since Thomas's call that morning. The document he'd been reviewing before the bank started calling was still open on his desk. Its numbers meaningless now in the way that all precise details become meaninless when the larger architecture they're embedded in turns out to be different from what you believed. At 4:45, Min-jung knocked. "The corporate files you requested," she said. She carried a banker's box, which she set on the edge of the desk with the careful precision of a woman who understood that this box contained something significant and had decided the most professional response to that understanding was perfect physical steadiness. "Thank you." She left without being asked to. He opened the box. The financing documentation from 3 years ago was on top. He'd asked for it specifically, and Min-jung had understood specifically. He pulled the file and opened it on the desk in front of him, and he read the covenant structure the way he should have read it when Thomas first presented it to him. He read it differently now, because now he had the context that changed everything. The provisions that Thomas had described as personal, in a way that standard financing covenants usually aren't. Jae-min could see them clearly, reading with the knowledge of who had written them. The specific protections, the particular clauses that preserved the integrity of the businesses in ways that went beyond what a purely financial lender would require. The language that said, between every line, "I am not just protecting my investment, I am protecting what you built." She had written these covenants to protect him from his own people, and his own people had violated them anyway, with his knowledge, because he had looked at those protections and decided, somewhere in the 3rd year, that they applied to someone else's business decisions and not his own. He closed the file. He put it back in the box. He sat at his desk in the descending late afternoon light with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, and he tried to locate the version of himself that had made those decisions, that had authorized Thomas and the others to restructure those transactions, that had looked at what Sienna had quietly built around his empire and decided it was an obstacle rather than a shelter. He found that version easily enough. It wasn't hard to find. It had been sitting in this chair making decisions for 3 years. That was the part he couldn't organize into something more manageable. Tuesday passed in a controlled performance. Jae-min attended his meetings. He said the right things. He asked the right questions about the expansion timeline and listened to the answers with the focused attention of a man who had been managing his external presentation since he was 19 years old and had learned that the surface is the last thing you let crack, because once it cracks, everything beneath it becomes visible, and visible is the beginning of vulnerable. Internally, he was doing something else entirely. He was running assessments, the specific, cold, rapid calculations of a man trying to determine the full dimensions of a problem before the problem fully declares itself. The credit freeze affected liquidity across 7 legitimate business entities. The expansion financing he'd arranged independently was still in place, but the expansion required the legitimate businesses as structural support, as the respectable framework inside which the new territory arrangements would be organized. Without the liquidity those businesses normally provided, the expansion timeline was compromised in ways that would become visible to his partners within weeks. He needed Thursday to go a certain way. He spent Tuesday night in his midtown apartment. He kept it for nights when returning to Long Island was impractical, which had become most nights in the past year, reviewing what he knew about Axiom Crown's negotiating history. What he could find. The company was, as Suhan had noted, extraordinarily private. Its public footprint was minimal relative to its size. The business press mentioned it occasionally, always in the context of transactions already completed rather than positions being taken, as though the company preferred to be written about in the past tense. He found 3 photographs of Sienna in an archived society column from 9 years ago, before she disappeared from those circles. In one of them, she was at some charity event, standing beside a man he didn't recognize, wearing a blue dress he'd never seen, and an expression that was formally pleasant and gave away nothing. She looked young. She also looked, in the particular way of people who are very good at managing public situations, completely at ease. He hadn't known her then. He'd met her 2 years after this photograph was taken, at a gallery in Chelsea, when she was wearing jeans and a dark jacket and looking at a painting of a coastline in winter with an expression that was the direct opposite of formally pleasant, an expression that was purely, privately absorbed. He'd fallen in love with that expression. That was the honest accounting of it. The woman who could look at a painting in a crowded room and simply be inside the experience of looking. He closed his laptop. He did not sleep easily. Wednesday arrived with the specific quality of days that are primarily waiting for the day after them. At 10 in the morning, Yuri called. He let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready for Yuri yet, not because he'd decided anything definitive, but because Yuri required a quality of attention he didn't currently have available, and giving her a diminished version of it would create problems that he didn't need adjacent to the ones he already had. She called again at 11:40. He answered. You've been avoiding me, she said. Not with hurt. Yuri was too strategic for hurt. With the precise observation of a woman who had been tracking data points and arrived at a conclusion. I've been busy. With the credit situation. He paused. Where did you hear about that? Jae-min, I hear things. You know I hear things. That's partly why you wanted me beside you. A beat. What's happening with the financing? It's being resolved. By who? By me. Another pause from her end, longer than the first. He could hear her thinking. Not literally, but he knew her well enough to track the architecture of her silences. Yuri Han's pauses had texture. This one had the texture of a woman who was calculating whether to say the thing she'd actually called to say. Someone told me, she said carefully, that the credit freeze originated with a company connected to the Vale Kessler family. Jae-min went very still. Who told you that? Does it matter? It matters considerably. One of Thomas Bay's people, someone in his department who... Thomas's department has a leak, Jae-min said. His voice had gone to the register that Min Jung would have recognized immediately and responded to by clearing the outer office. Yuri heard it too. He felt her recalibrate slightly, felt the pause that meant she was deciding how much of what she knew to deploy right now. Yuri, he kept his voice level. I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to answer it directly. Of course. How much do you know about Sienna's financial background? Silence. Long enough to be its own answer. Yuri. I knew she came from money, Yuri said. I didn't know the specifics. When did you know? Jae-min, when? Another pause, shorter this time. The pause of someone who has decided that the cost of continuing to manage information has exceeded the cost of releasing it. About 8 months ago, someone in my network mentioned the Vale Kessler name in connection with your wife. I looked into it briefly. I didn't find much. Their corporate structure is deliberately obscured, but I found enough to understand that she wasn't who you thought she was. The room seemed to adjust its dimensions slightly. He sat with what she'd said. 8 months ago, he repeated. Yes. You knew 8 months ago that my wife had a significant financial background connected to Axiom Crown Holdings, and you said nothing to me. I didn't know about the connection to your financing. You knew something significant and said nothing to me. Her voice changed. Something underneath the strategy came through. Not quite guilt. Yuri wasn't built for guilt in the traditional sense, but something adjacent to it. The discomfort of someone who has made a calculated choice and is now being asked to account for it by someone whose opinion of them still matters. I was protecting something, she said. What were you protecting? What we were building, what we were moving toward. She paused. If I'd told you, you would have... I didn't know how you would have responded. I didn't know if it would have changed things between you and Sienna. I didn't want to be the variable that sent you back to her. He didn't speak for a moment. So you protected yourself, he said. I protected us. Those aren't the same thing, Yuri. He ended the call. He sat at the table in his midtown apartment with his phone in his hand and the specific quiet of a man who has just had the dimensions of his situation expand in a direction he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't that Yuri's information would have changed Thursday. Thursday was what it was regardless. But the knowledge that she had sat beside him for 8 months with that information, weighing it, managing it, deciding what to release and when, that changed the texture of everything he'd believed he was building. He was very tired. He called Soo-han. Find out who in Thomas Bay's department has been talking outside the organization, he said, specifically about the Axiom Crown situation. Timeline? Yesterday. Thursday morning arrived like a verdict. He was at the corporate offices by 7:30. He told himself it was because there were things to review before 10, which was true. He did not tell himself the other thing, which was also true, that he'd woken at 5 and lain awake in the midtown apartment with the ceiling above him and the city making its nighttime sounds outside, and the knowledge of what today was sitting on his chest like something with physical weight. Minjung was already at her desk. She looked at him when he came through, and her face said nothing except that she was present and ready, which was the most professional form of support available to her, and she deployed it precisely. His senior people began arriving at 8. Thomas Bay came in at 8:15, looking like a man who hadn't slept since Monday, which Jae-min suspected he hadn't. Two of the corporate attorneys took the conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. The head of operations, a man named Choi, appeared in the hallway and fell into step beside Jae-min without being asked. "How do you want to play this?" Choi asked. Straightforwardly. Choi absorbed this. "She's going to want full access to the financials." "She already has full access to the financials. She owns the debt secured against those assets. She's had the right to this information for 3 years. We just didn't know she was exercising it." Choi was quiet for a moment. He was a large, careful man who had been with Jae-min since the early years, one of the few people in the organization who Jae-min had always trusted to say the uncomfortable thing. "There are people in this building," Choi said, "who have heard pieces of what's happening. Not everything, but enough to be nervous. They should be calm." "They're not. Tell them to be calm." "Jae-min." Choi stopped walking. He said it quietly, in the voice he used in private as opposed to the voice he used in rooms. "Are you going to be able to fix this?" Jae-min stopped too. He looked at Choi, really looked at him the way you look at someone when the performance of certainty is too exhausting to maintain. "I don't know yet," he said. Choi nodded, slowly, the nod of a man who respects the honesty more than he feared the answer. They kept walking. At 9:58, the private elevator on the far side of the executive floor opened. Corporate attorneys came out first, 3 of them, carrying the kind of organized document cases that meant they had come prepared for every contingency. Then 2 members of a financial review team, identifiable by the way, they moved through the space with the careful attention of people who were already assessing it. Then 2 members of a security detail. And then Sienna. Jae-min was standing at the head of the boardroom table when she came through the door. He had prepared himself. Or he had believed he had prepared himself, which turned out to be a different thing. The woman who walked onto his executive floor was wearing a charcoal suit cut with the precise intentionality of someone who had never needed clothes to announce their status, but understood exactly how clothes functioned in rooms like this. Her hair was down, which was different from the way she'd worn it at the estate. No jewelry except small, plain earrings. She carried nothing, no bag, no documents. Her team carried the documents. Her expression was composed in a way that Jae-min recognized because he'd watched her construct that composure in other rooms over 4 years. The difference was that in those rooms she'd been maintaining it under pressure. Now she wasn't maintaining it. She was simply wearing it, the way a person wears something that fits correctly and requires no adjustment. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the 11 men arranged around the boardroom table became briefly and completely irrelevant. "Sienna," he said. "Jae-min," she said. 2 syllables each, and between them 4 years and $300 million, and a painting of a coastline in winter, and a dining room table, and the sound of rain on Long Island Sound. Mi-suk was seated 2 positions to Jae-min's right. She had insisted on being present, and Jae-min had, after a short argument, allowed it because keeping her away would have required an energy he needed for other things. Mi-suk sat very straight, her hands folded on the table, looking at Sienna with an expression that contained no warmth and was, for the first time in 4 years, not accompanied by the certainty of superiority. Sienna glanced at Mi-suk. One glance, measured, and then back to the room at large. "Let's begin," Sienna said. She took the chair at the opposite end of the table from Jae-min. Her lead attorney placed the primary documentation in front of her. She opened it without looking at it. She already knew what it said, and looked instead at Thomas Bay, who was seated midway down the table's left side and had not been able to bring himself to make eye contact with anyone since the meeting started. "Mr. Bay," she said, "I'd like to start with the credit line restructuring you authorized in March of last year." Thomas Bay's jaw tightened. He looked at Jae-min. Jae-min gave him nothing. No direction, no permission, no denial. Because Jae-min had understood, sitting in his office Wednesday night, that the strategy of the next several hours could not be deflection. She had the audit. She had the documentation. Deflection would accomplish nothing except making him look like a man trying to deflect. The March restructuring, Thomas said, with the careful pronunciation of a man choosing each word individually, was intended to optimize the liquidity structure of Mr. Bay. Sienna's voice was patient, not warm, patient in the way of a teacher who has heard the wrong answer before and is waiting for the right one. We have the transactions. We have the accounts. We have the authorization chain. She turned one page of the document in front of her. I'm not asking what it was intended to do. I'm asking why the individuals listed in this authorization chain believed it was appropriate to restructure financing that was explicitly protected under our covenant agreement. Silence around the table. Thomas looked at Jae-min again. Mr. Bay is going to look at you several more times today, Sienna said to Jae-min. And each time he does, I'd like to note for everyone present that the authorization chain in this document ends with your signature. The room changed, not dramatically. No one moved, no voices rose. But the quality of the air shifted in the way that boardrooms shift when someone has said the true thing that everyone present knew but had not yet heard spoken aloud. Jae-min sat forward slightly. The transactions were executed by your CFO with your authorization, secured against assets that were explicitly protected under the terms of the financing agreement your organization signed 3 years ago. She turned another page. I'm not going to argue the documentation, Jae-min. The documentation is not disputed. The question I'm here to resolve is what happens next. Mi-suk's hands, which had been folded on the table, separated. She placed them flat on the surface on either side of her. A small, involuntary movement that Jae-min noticed because he noticed everything Mi-suk's hands did. What happens next, Mi-suk said, is that this matter is resolved between our legal teams in the appropriate setting, which is not Mi-suk. Jae-min's voice was quiet but absolute. Mi-suk stopped. Sienna hadn't looked at her during this exchange. She looked now, a direct, unhurried assessment. Mrs. Kwon, Sienna said, you're welcome to stay. The phrasing was precise. You're welcome to stay. Not please stay, not you're needed here. A permission, offered in a room where 3 years ago the older woman had functioned as judge. Mi-suk understood. Her expression held, but something behind it shifted, and the shift was visible to anyone in the room who was paying close enough attention. The assets securing the defaulted covenants, Sienna's lead attorney said, placing a supplementary document in the center of the table, include Kwon International's corporate headquarters, this building, as well as 4 additional commercial properties, 11 residential and mixed-use properties, the warehouse and logistics network in New Jersey, and the club properties in Manhattan and Queens. The number of people around the table who visibly reacted to this list was 4. Everyone else had either already known or had trained themselves not to react. Jae-min was in the second category. He watched the list being placed on the table, and his expression gave away nothing except the small, controlled tightening at the corners of his jaw that Min-jung had once described. To her sister, who asked, as the sound of a door being closed very quietly in a very large house. The value of the defaulted instruments, the attorney continued, exceeds the secured assets at current valuation by approximately $40 million. Axiom Crown reserves the right to pursue the differential through additional legal instruments. Thomas Bay made a sound. Not a word. A sound. The involuntary compression of air from someone who has just heard a number they'd calculated but hoped was wrong. However, Sienna said, the word landed with its own weight. Around the table, posture changed. Infinitesimally, but changed. Axiom Crown is not in the business of destroying functional enterprises. She closed the document in front of her. Closed it, not set it aside. A deliberate gesture. The legitimate businesses attached to Kwon International employ approximately 2,000 people directly. We're not interested in liquidation. We're interested in restructuring. Jae-min looked at her. Which is why, she continued, I'm prepared to offer a restructuring proposal that preserves the employment base and the operating capacity of those businesses under new management oversight, Axiom Crown oversight, for a period of 18 months, at the end of which Kwon International may attempt to repurchase controlling interest at assessed market value. The room processed this. It was, on its face, more than fair. It was more than the law required. And everyone in the room with the intelligence to assess it understood immediately that it was also not primarily an act of generosity. It was an act of architecture. She wasn't destroying what he'd built. She was acquiring it, responsibly, legally, with the documentation to support every step. Choi, sitting 3 seats to Jae-min's left, was looking at Sienna with an expression that Jae-min recognized. The expression of someone reevaluating information they believed they already had and finding it insufficient. "I'd like to speak privately," Jae-min said. "Of course. With you. Not with legal teams." A pause. Not hesitation. A pause. There was a difference. 15 minutes, Sienna said, after we complete the formal presentation. They sat in his private office 40 minutes later. The building's private office, which was, he now understood in a way he hadn't fully processed until this moment, technically collateral under the agreement his attorneys had just been presented. He closed the door. He stood with his back to it for a moment, looking at her across the room. She had sat down, not behind the desk, but in one of the 2 chairs facing it, which was itself a choice he noticed. She was not taking his position. She was sitting where a guest would sit. The precision of that was not lost on him. He came and sat in the other chair. They were 3 feet apart, and everything they had been to each other existed in that 3 feet-like weather. "You saved my organization 3 years ago," he said. Not asking, saying, "Yes." "Without telling me." "Yes." "Why?" She looked at him with the directness she'd always had in private, the quality that had disappeared from their marriage somewhere in year 3, and that he'd noticed the absence of without ever finding the language to name it. "Because I knew if you found out, you would never be able to hold what it meant," she said. "You needed to believe you'd navigated the crisis yourself. That belief was load-bearing for you, for everything you were building." She paused. "I was protecting the man, not the empire." He sat with that. "And then the violations," he said. "And then the violations. If I hadn't—" "But you did, Jae-min." Not harshly, simply. He looked at his hands. He had his father's hands, broad, with the specific weight of someone who had spent years learning to use them for control rather than expression. He'd been told that since he was a boy. "You have your father's hands," like it was a promise of something. "I need to know one thing," he said. She waited. "Is this—" He stopped. He found the sentence again. "Is the restructuring proposal on that table what this has always been moving toward? Is this why you married you?" "Yes." Sienna looked at him for a moment that held everything: the gallery, the walks along the Sound, the breakfast room in the early years, the small study in the later ones, the dining room table on Friday night. "No," she said. And then something happened that neither of them had planned for Thursday. Her phone buzzed on the arm of the chair. She glanced at it, the involuntary reflex of someone managing multiple moving parts, and something crossed her face, just briefly, a flash of something that didn't fit the composure. Jae-min saw it. "What is it?" She looked at the screen once more, and in that second look he saw something he hadn't seen from her in 4 years of marriage. Not fear, not anger, something more precise and more alarming than either. Uncertainty. She stood. "I need to make a call." "Sienna, 1 minute," she said. She stepped to the far side of the office, turned partially away, and made the call. She spoke quietly. Quiet enough that he could hear the tone and register without catching specific words. He watched her back, the line of her shoulders, and he had spent 4 years learning to read her body language in the way that people who live together learn to read each other's physical grammar. Her shoulders were doing something he'd never seen before. She ended the call, stood with her back to him for 1 additional second. Then she turned. Her face had reorganized. Not completely. The composure was there, the frame of it. But inside the frame something had shifted that she hadn't had time to fully address. "There's a development," she said. "What kind?" She looked at him, and in that look was the specific quality of someone deciding whether to include a person in something they'd just learned, weighing it in real time, in front of him, without the buffer of preparation. "The Axiom Crown shares," she said, "the controlling interest my father left me, the legal structure protecting my ownership." He felt something in his chest move. "What about it?" "Someone has filed a challenge," she said, "an inheritance challenge. Filed this morning while we've been in this room." She took 1 breath. If it holds through preliminary review, the challenge would call into question whether my controlling interest in Axiom Crown is legally... She stopped. Not because she couldn't finish the sentence, because the full weight of what finishing it meant had just arrived in the room between them, and for the first time since Friday night, Sienna Vale Kessler was standing in an office, her building, her restructured empire, looking at a future that had just become something other than what she'd calculated. The challenge, if it held, didn't just threaten Thursday's restructuring proposal. It threatened the entire foundation of everything she'd come here to execute. And the man sitting 3 feet away from her, the man whose organization she was in the process of dismantling, was watching her face with the expression of someone who has just witnessed the ground shift under someone else's feet and knows, from recent personal experience, exactly what the ground shift under someone else's feet, and knows, from recent personal experience, exactly what that feels like from the inside. He stood up. Not because he had a plan, not because he'd calculated the next move. He stood up because sitting while she absorbed this felt wrong in a way that bypassed strategy entirely and landed somewhere older and more basic. "Who filed it?" he said. "I don't know yet." "When did your team find out?" 11 minutes ago. Daniel is pulling the filing now." She had her phone in both hands, her thumbs moving, and he could see the precise controlled speed of someone managing crisis while simultaneously managing the performance of managing crisis. The thing you do when you cannot afford to let the room behind you see what the room in front of you contains. "The basis of the challenge," he said. "What grounds?" She looked up from the phone, looked at him directly. "Contested validity of the original inheritance documentation. Someone is arguing that the transfer of controlling interest from my father's estate was procedurally defective." "Is it?" "No." "Then it gets thrown." "Challenges like this don't get thrown in 11 minutes, Jae-min. They take months to litigate. And during litigation..." She stopped. He finished it. "During litigation, your controlling interest is in question, which means the restructuring proposal on that table is in question, which means everything you came here to execute today is legally vulnerable," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. She looked at him. Between them, the thing that had been 3 feet of history expanded briefly into something larger and then contracted back down into the immediate, specific problem of right now. "Come back into the boardroom," he said. "I need 5 more minutes. Sienna." He said it the way he hadn't said her name in a long time, not as a direction, as something else. "Come back into the boardroom. Don't let them see this yet." She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she put the phone in her jacket pocket and stood straight. They walked back through the door together. The boardroom had the particular charged stillness of a room full of people who have been left alone with significant information and have spent the interval discussing it in the specific low-register way that means nobody wanted to be caught discussing it. Sienna took her seat. Her expression gave nothing away. Jae-min watched his own people watching her and saw what he'd seen in Choi's face earlier. The recalibration, the active reassessment of someone whose categories for a situation were proving insufficient. Daniel Park was not in the room. He was somewhere on the floor with a phone and whatever the filing contained, working at the speed that Jae-min had, in the past 6 days, come to understand was his baseline. Sienna's lead attorney, a woman named Rachel Cho, whose face had remained professionally neutral for the entire morning, leaned toward Sienna and spoke quietly. Sienna listened without changing her expression and then spoke 2 words back. Jae-min was watching and still couldn't read the 2 words. "We'll take a brief recess," Rachel Cho announced to the room. Thomas Bay, who had been sitting in the specific stillness of a man trying not to exist, looked up. Mai Suk, who had been quiet since Jae-min had silenced her, looked at her son. Jae-min looked at no one. The recess lasted 22 minutes. Jae-min spent them in the hallway outside the boardroom with Choi, speaking quietly and rapidly about nothing he could fully concentrate on because part of his mind was in the side office where Sienna and her team had withdrawn, working the problem he'd just watched arrive on her face. "Who has the standing to challenge a Vale Kessler inheritance?" Choi asked. "Someone with a claim on the original estate, which means family, or someone manufactured into appearing like family." Jae-min kept his voice level. "The Vale Kessler estate is 40 years old and Richard had dealings across 3 continents. You can construct a challenge out of almost any historical complexity if you have the right attorneys and enough time to prepare." And the timing, Choi said. Jae-min looked at him. The timing, Choi repeated. This was filed this morning, while she was in this building, while the restructuring meeting was happening. He paused. Someone knew she was going to be here today executing a significant financial action. Someone who wanted to interrupt that action at the most damaging possible moment. Jaemin's mind moved very fast. Pull Thomas, he said quietly. Jae-min, pull Thomas out of that boardroom and bring him to my office. Now. Without drawing attention, Choi moved. Thomas Bay sat in the chair across from Jae-min's desk, with his hands on his knees and the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific conversation for longer than the conversation has been coming. Jae-min closed the door. He didn't sit behind the desk. He stood in front of it, between the desk and Thomas, which was a positioning choice that Thomas felt in his chest before his brain fully processed it. The inheritance challenge, Jae-min said, filed this morning. Someone had to know she was going to be here today. Someone had to know the timing. Thomas opened his mouth. Don't, Jae-min said. Thomas closed it. The leak in your department, Jae-min continued. The person talking to Yuri about Axiom Crown. Same person. Thomas looked at the floor, a specific kind of looking at the floor that was not evasion, but something more like a man measuring the distance between where he was and where he'd intended to be when he started moving. Thomas. I don't know who filed the challenge, Thomas said. To the floor. Then he raised his eyes. I want to be clear about that. I don't know who filed it. But you know something. I know that approximately 3 weeks ago, someone contacted me through an intermediary. He said it like a man placing a heavy object on a table, carefully, with both hands, making sure it was stable before he let go. Someone who was aware of the Axiom Crown connection. Not all of it, but enough. They wanted to know the meeting schedule. When Axiom Crown's representatives were expected to interface directly with Kwon International. Jaemin's jaw tightened. And you told them. I didn't. Thomas stopped. I didn't tell them directly. I didn't respond to the intermediary. But someone in my department had access to Minjung's scheduling system, and I didn't. He stopped again. I didn't move to close that access when I should have. Because. Thomas's hands moved on his knees, just slightly. Because the intermediary suggested they had information that might protect me, personally, from the covenant violation exposure. The room was very quiet. They offered to protect you, Jae-min said, from the consequences of what you did to her financing structure. Yes. In exchange for access to her meeting schedule. I didn't confirm, Thomas. Jae-min's voice dropped to the register that didn't require volume to carry weight. You left the door open. That's the same thing. Thomas Bay sat with his hands on his knees and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would change the arithmetic of what had happened. Who was the intermediary? Jae-min said. A contact I've used before for the name. Park Sung-jin. Jae-min knew the name. Not well. A peripheral figure, someone who moved in spaces adjacent to his world without being directly inside it, the kind of person who was useful precisely because they were adjacent rather than embedded. Park Sung-jin works for whom? Thomas shook his head. Genuinely, Jae-min assessed. I don't know. He's always operated as independent. No one who does what he does is independent. Jae-min moved to the desk. He pressed the intercom. Min Jung. Yes. Get me Suhan immediately. He looked at Thomas. You're going to sit in this room until I tell you to move. Thomas nodded. He looked, Jae-min thought, like a man who had been expecting to be told to sit in a room and had been sitting an internal version of it for 3 weeks. Suhan answered in 30 seconds. Park Sung-jin, Jae-min said. Who does he work for? Right now. Active relationship. He heard Suhan's keyboard, a pause of perhaps 45 seconds that felt considerably longer. Current active relationship, Suhan said. This is interesting. Say it. Park Sung-jin's fees for the past 14 months have been routed through a shell entity that traces back, this takes 2 layers, to a financial advisory group associated with a man named Victor Laszlo. Jae-min had heard the name, distantly. Laszlo, the estate attorney. Richard Vale Kessler's estate attorney, Suhan said. Specifically. The man who managed the transfer of Axiom Crown's controlling interest to Sienna 8 years ago. The silence lasted 3 seconds. He's behind the inheritance challenge, Jae-min said. I can't confirm that directly, but the financial relationship, the timing, and the subject matter of Sung-jin's recent activities suggest. Why would Vale Kessler's own estate attorney challenge the inheritance he managed? More keyboard. Then, because 8 years ago, Richard Vale Kessler changed his estate documentation in the final 6 weeks before his death. Significantly. The previous version of his estate allocation, which Laszlo had been working with for 11 years, was substantially different from what was ultimately filed, specifically regarding the distribution of Axiom Crown's controlling interest. Different how? The previous version distributed controlling interest across a trust structure that would have given Laszlo's advisory group ongoing management fees and partial governance rights. The final version transferred control entirely and cleanly to Sienna. Jae-min sat down, not at the desk. In the chair beside it, just sat down. Laszlo lost 11 years of anticipated governance rights when Richard changed the will, he said, and has apparently spent 8 years waiting for the right moment to challenge it, Suhan said. The right moment being when Sienna is executing a major financial action that makes her ownership of Axiom Crown directly relevant to a legal dispute. Because if the challenge creates even temporary uncertainty about her controlling interest, the restructuring action could be stayed, the credit freeze could be legally complicated, it creates leverage. Suhan paused. Someone told him about the Thursday meeting. I know, Jae-min said. Get me everything on the documentation change, the 6 weeks before Richard died. Every meeting Laszlo had during that period. Every communication you can access. Timeline? 2 hours. He ended the call. He sat in that chair for 30 seconds, not strategizing, just sitting, with the full map of what was happening spread in front of him. A challenge designed to fracture her position at the precise moment she was using it. Constructed by a man who'd been building the case for 8 years and had been handed the timing by someone inside Jae-min's own organization. He stood up. He went back to the boardroom. Sienna was at the far end of the table with Rachel Cho and Daniel Park, the three of them in tight conference over a document Daniel had produced. She looked up when Jae-min came through the door. He walked directly to her end of the table. I know who's behind the challenge, he said. The room behind him, Thomas's empty chair, the remaining attorneys, 2 members of Sienna's financial team, went very still. Rachel Cho looked at him with the expression of an attorney who has been trained to receive unexpected information without reaction and is applying that training with some effort. Daniel Park looked at Sienna. Sienna looked at Jae-min. Tell me. Victor Laszlo. The name landed differently on different faces. Rachel Cho's changed slightly, a small, rapid shift of someone who has just had a missing piece arrive. Daniel's changed more. Something that wasn't quite surprise but looked like the specific expression of a person who has been close to an answer for a long time and has just heard it said aloud. Sienna's didn't change at all. You know the name, Jae-min said. I know the name. You're not surprised. She picked up a pen from the table, set it down. A small motion, a half-second grounding gesture. I've been watching Laszlo's activity for 18 months. He's been making inquiries about the original estate documentation. I knew he was building toward something. I didn't know the timing, because someone in my organization gave him the timing. Thomas Bay, Daniel said. Not a question. He didn't know what he was enabling, Jae-min said. He thought he was protecting himself. He left access open that he should have closed. He looked at Sienna. I'm responsible for that. The word responsible in Jae-min Kwon's voice, applied to something that had damaged her, had a quality that none of the people in the room had expected to hear from him. Rachel Cho looked at her pen. Daniel looked at the document. Sienna looked at Jae-min for a long moment. Can you get the documentation on the estate change? She said. The 6 weeks before my father died. I have someone on it now. Laszlo was in that room for those 6 weeks, she said. He was my father's attorney. He managed everything, but my father changed the will without him. He used an independent notary and a separate attorney for the final documentation. Laszlo never accepted that the change was legally clean because he was never part of executing it. Was it clean? Rachel Cho asked. My father was the most methodical man I've ever known, Sienna said. He changed that will because he'd decided that Laszlo had been managing the estate for his own interests for 11 years, and that he'd only discovered it 2 months before he died. She paused. He fired Laszlo 6 weeks before the final estate documentation was filed. Laszlo has been contesting it in every available forum except a direct legal challenge ever since. Why not a direct challenge? Jae-min said. Until now. Because a direct challenge requires evidence that the final documentation was procedurally defective. He's been trying to find that evidence for 8 years, without finding it. She looked at the document Daniel had placed in front of her. Which means what he filed this morning is a challenge constructed on manufactured evidence. Not found evidence. Made. Rachel Cho picked up her phone immediately. If it's manufactured, Jae-min said, it can be dismantled. In months, Sienna said, which is the point. He doesn't need to win. He needs to create delay. He needs to put my controlling interest in legal ambiguity long enough to compromise this restructuring action. Jae-min looked at her. What do you need? She looked back at him. The question hung there, straightforward, direct, and coming from a man who had been on the opposite side of every interest in this room 2 hours ago. The independent notary who executed my father's final estate documentation, she said. His name is Howard Kessel. He's 71 years old and he lives in Connecticut, and he is the only person alive besides Laszlo who was present in the room with my father during the period Laszlo is going to claim the documentation was compromised. You need his testimony. I need him in a room with our attorneys before Laszlo's people get to him first. She looked at Daniel. We've been trying to reach him since this morning. He's not answering. Because Laszlo's people may already be there, Daniel said. Jae-min pulled out his phone, called Soo-han again. Howard Kessel, Notary Public, Connecticut, 71 years old. I need a location in the next 15 minutes and I need someone there in the next 30. That's Soo-han. 15 minutes, Soo-han said. He ended the call. He looked at Sienna. She was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen from her since the early years. Not warm, not forgiving, not even close to either of those things, but something that was its own specific category. The expression of someone watching another person do something that they didn't predict. Jae-min, Choi said from the doorway. He'd appeared there sometime in the past minutes without Jae-min registering his arrival, which was not something that usually happened. Jae-min turned. Choi's expression said, not in front of the room. He stepped into the hallway. Choi spoke very quietly. We have a situation downstairs, the building lobby. 2 men. They came in 8 minutes ago and identified themselves to building security as process servers with court documentation related to the Axiom Crown estate challenge. They're trying to serve papers on her directly. They're trying to serve papers on her legal team. If those papers are served, the restructuring action is automatically stayed pending review. The building is technically collateral under the existing debt structure, which means they could argue we have an obligation to cooperate with the service. Our security chief is asking what to do. Jae-min stood in the hallway outside his boardroom on the 26th floor of a building he no longer fully owned, with his CFO sitting alone in his office and his organization's financial future contingent on the next 15 minutes, and he made a decision that he did not pause to evaluate for its strategic merits because there was no time, and because strategy had stopped being the primary operating principle approximately 1 hallway conversation ago. Tell security, he said, that the building is currently in active restructuring negotiations between its owners, that no external process can be received during active negotiations without the consent of both owning parties, and that those persons are to wait in the lobby until our legal teams have determined the appropriate procedure. He paused, and call the building's legal counsel, right now. Choi was already moving. Jae-min went back into the boardroom. We have 2 men in your lobby, he said to Rachel Cho. Process servers, attempting to serve papers related to the challenge. Rachel Cho stood up from her chair in one motion. I need your building's legal counsel, she said to Jae-min, being reached now. And I need 5 minutes with my client. She looked at Sienna. Sienna nodded. The room cleared except for Sienna and Rachel. Jae-min stood in the hallway again, this time with Daniel Park beside him, and the two of them stood in the particular shared silence of people who are on opposite sides of something and are currently, for the duration of a specific emergency, functioning in parallel. She knew Laszlo was building toward something, Jae-min said. Daniel looked at him. Yes. She knew for 18 months. She monitors everything that moves near Axiom Crown's structure. She has since her father died. She came here today anyway, knowing there was a risk. She calculated the risk was manageable. Daniel paused. He was not a man who volunteered information, Jae-min had gathered. He was a man who answered questions with precision and kept the rest. But something about this hallway, this particular compressed moment, seemed to shift that default slightly. She's been calculating this for 4 months. The timing, the documentation, the approach. Every contingency she could identify, she prepared for. He looked at the closed boardroom door. Laszlo was on the contingency list. She didn't think he'd move this fast. Why not? Because she underestimated, Daniel said simply, how badly he'd been waiting. Jae-min's phone buzzed. Suhan. Kessel, Suhan said. He's at his home address in Westport. I have a man 12 minutes out. Is anyone else there? No vehicles outside the property that don't belong there. But Jae-min. If Laszlo's people haven't reached him yet, they will in the next hour. They filed this morning. They know they need him neutralized. Tell your man to knock on the door and not leave until Kessel has spoken to someone from Axiom Crown's legal team. And if Kessel doesn't want to talk, tell him Victor Laszlo filed a legal challenge this morning using his name and the events of the 6 weeks preceding Richard Vale Kessler's death. Tell him that. Jae-min paused. And tell him that Richard's daughter needs him. He went back into the boardroom. Rachel Cho was on her feet, phone to her ear, speaking in the rapid technical shorthand of an attorney doing 4 things simultaneously. Sienna was standing at the window. The Manhattan skyline behind her, the same city Jae-min had looked out at from this window hundreds of times, believing he understood the dimensions of what he owned. He stood beside her, not close. 3 feet, maybe 4. The same 3 feet that had held everything in his private office. My man is 12 minutes from your notary, he said quietly. She didn't look away from the window. If Laszlo's people get there first, they haven't yet. You can't know that. I know my people are faster. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved in its indifferent afternoon way, cabs and pedestrians, and the enormous, impersonal machinery of a place that had seen 1,000 versions of this same pressure and would see 1,000 more. My father changed that will, she said, still to the window, because he found out that Laszlo had been taking money from the estate's advisory accounts for 9 years. Not enough to be obvious, enough to matter over time. She paused. He also found out, 2 months before he died, that Laszlo had approached 2 members of the Axiom Crown board independently, without my father's knowledge, about what a governance restructuring might look like if the controlling interest were distributed differently. Jae-min said nothing. He was building a position, she said. Laszlo was. Building it slowly, over 11 years, the way you build something when you're very patient and you believe the person you're building around will eventually not be there to stop you. She turned from the window. My father stopped him. Changed everything 6 weeks before he died. Left Laszlo with 11 years of work and no position and nothing he could legally do about it except wait for me to make a move large enough that challenging it was worth the exposure. And you made the move. I made the move. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Something in her face shifted, a rapid, controlled movement of information across her features. Kessel answered the door, she said. Jae-min let out a breath he hadn't fully registered holding. He's talking, she said. She read the message, reading fast. He says Laszlo contacted him 6 days ago, asking him to provide a statement about the condition of Richard's mental state during the final estate changes. She looked up. He refused. He told Laszlo he would not provide that statement, which means the challenge is built on testimony Laszlo doesn't actually have. Which means when we get Kessel in front of our attorneys and his testimony is formally documented, the challenge falls. Her jaw tightened slightly. But getting his formal testimony takes time, and the papers in the lobby. The boardroom door opened. Rachel Cho came in with the expression of an attorney who has been in worse situations than this and has found that the key quality for surviving them is forward motion. The building's legal counsel is on their way up, she said. We have a procedural argument for delaying the service based on the active nature of the restructuring negotiations. It buys us time, not resolution. How much time? Sienna said. 48 to 72 hours before a court would compel the building to accept service. And Kessel's formal testimony. If he's cooperative and we can get him in front of a notary with our team present, 18 to 24 hours minimum. Sienna looked at Jae-min. He looked at her. The gap, she said. Between 48 hours and 24 hours, we have a window where Kessel's testimony is documented, but the service has not yet been formally received. In that window, Jae-min said, the restructuring documentation that was presented in this room today is still legally actionable. If it's executed before the service is received, which means we need to execute today, which means we need Kessel's testimony accelerated significantly beyond 18 hours. They looked at each other. I have a retired federal judge, Jae-min said slowly, who owes me a conversation. He said it with the specific phrasing of a man who has been in his world for long enough to have assembled a particular kind of relationship inventory. He's not in the business anymore. He has no official capacity, but a retired federal judge who was present for a notarial statement has a weight that a standard notary in Westport, Connecticut does not. Rachel Cho looked at Jae-min with the expression of an attorney recalibrating her assessment of a man she'd walked in this morning, prepared to consider an adversary. Can you reach him today? She said. In the next hour, Jae-min said. Yes. Sienna held his gaze. Something moved between them. Not reconciliation, not absolution, nothing that clean, but something that was its own category. The specific recognition of two people who have been in opposition and have discovered, in the pressure of a shared emergency, that their capacities are complementary in ways they'd each have preferred not to need. Make the call, she said. He was already pulling out his phone when the boardroom door opened again and Choi appeared, and the expression on Choi's face was the one Jae-min had learned to read in 17 years of working alongside him. The expression that meant the situation had just developed a new dimension that nobody in the room was going to enjoy. Jae-min, Choi said. The lobby. The process servers, they're not the problem anymore. Choi looked at Sienna, then back at Jae-min. Mi-suk went down to the lobby 20 minutes ago. We didn't know. She went down without telling anyone, and she spoke to the process servers directly. The room went silent. She identified herself, Choi said, as a representative of Kwon International, and she told them that the building would cooperate with the service. He stopped. They served the papers, Jae-min. 20 minutes ago. The stay is in effect. Nobody in the room moved. Sienna looked at the table. Not at Jae-min, not at Rachel Cho, not at anyone. She looked at the table, at the restructuring proposal that was sitting on it, at the 43 pages of documentation that had seemed 90 minutes ago, like the culminating architecture of 4 months of precise, disciplined planning. Rachel Cho said very quietly, Sienna. Sienna didn't respond immediately. She stood at the boardroom table with her hands flat on its surface and her eyes on the documents and her face in the particular stillness of someone who has just absorbed a blow and is taking the split-second inventory of what is still intact. Then she raised her eyes to Jae-min. He was already moving toward the door. Where is she? He said to Choi. Still in the lobby. He walked out of the boardroom. The elevator took 11 seconds to reach the lobby. He counted them without intending to, the way the mind counts things when it's running on a parallel track from conscious. The elevator doors opened and Jae-min walked into the lobby of his building and saw his mother standing near the security desk with the posture of a woman who believes she has just won something. Mi-suk was wearing the dark coat she wore to formal occasions, the one with the silk lining that she'd had for 15 years and maintained with a specific, deliberate care that Jae-min had always understood as her way of honoring the life she'd built from very little. She was 63 years old, and she stood in that lobby like she owned the floor beneath her feet, which she had believed until very recently was essentially true. The two process servers were gone. The building's security chief, a former police officer named Garrett, who had been with Kwon International for 8 years, was standing 6 feet from Mi-suk with the expression of a man who has made a significant error and is currently measuring its dimensions. Jae-min crossed the lobby. Mi-suk turned when she heard his footsteps. She read his face in the way she'd been reading it for 36 years, and what she read there made something in her posture adjust. Not retreat. Mi-suk did not retreat, but recalibrate. The way a person recalibrates when the ground they're standing on proves to be at a different angle than they measured. What you did, Jae-min said, just cost this organization everything it had left to negotiate with. I protected this family's interests, Mi-suk said. You cooperated with a legal process designed by a man who has been working to destroy Sienna's inheritance for 8 years. You handed him his weapon. I handed no one anything. Those men had court documentation, which our legal team was actively blocking for 48 hours, which would have been enough. He stopped 6 feet from her, which was closer than he usually stood when they were having a conversation that wasn't going well. You went downstairs, Mother. You went downstairs without telling anyone. Why? Mi-suk looked at him. Her chin was slightly elevated, which was the physical expression of a position she intended to hold. Because that woman upstairs, she said, is dismantling everything this family built. Because while you were in that room playing whatever game you two have always played with each other, I was looking at what the end result of today was going to be. This organization loses its corporate structure, its properties, everything that took 30 years to build. The organization violated her agreements, Jae-min said, deliberately. We did what we needed to do to survive. No. His voice didn't rise. It went the other direction, lower, flatter, the register that meant there was no performance left in it. We did what we wanted to do because we decided the rules didn't apply to us. That's different. And the difference is exactly what's brought us to this lobby. Mi-suk's jaw tightened. She was never right for you. This isn't about right. I am your mother. I have spent 40 years. You went downstairs, Jae-min said, because you still believe she can be beaten. That's the only reason. You believe that if you can create enough legal complication around her inheritance, it buys time. It creates pressure. And under enough pressure, she might settle for something smaller than what the documents entitle her to. He looked at his mother directly. She won't. Mi-suk was quiet for a moment. You don't know that, she said. I know exactly that. He turned and walked back to the elevator. He pressed the button and stood with his back to the lobby, and he heard his mother say nothing further, which was its own kind of answer. Mi-suk's silence being the specific shape of a woman who has lost the argument but has not yet decided what to do with that fact. The elevator opened. He stepped in. The boardroom was quieter when he returned. Rachel Cho was on the phone in the corner, speaking in the measured, technical tones of an attorney constructing an argument in real time. Daniel Park was at the table with his laptop and 2 phones, and the focused stillness of a man running multiple processes simultaneously. 2 members of the financial review team had stepped out. Sienna was at the window again. She turned when he came in. She didn't understand what she was doing, he said. She understood that those men were there to serve papers, and she believed that serving them was in the organization's interest. He stopped. She was wrong, and she acted without my authorization. I want that on record with your team. Sienna looked at him for a moment. It's on record, she said. Rachel is already documenting it. It doesn't undo the service. No. What does it do? Sienna turned from the window and came to the table. She sat down. She looked at the restructuring proposal. Then she looked at Rachel Cho, who had ended her call and was standing near the head of the table with the particular quality of alertness that meant she had something to say and was waiting for the right moment to say it. Tell him, Sienna said to Rachel. Rachel Cho set her phone on the table. The stay that was triggered by service of the inheritance challenge papers applies specifically to financial restructuring actions predicated on the disputed controlling interest. It does not apply to, and does not stay, the enforcement of existing covenant default provisions. She paused. The covenant defaults predate the inheritance challenge by 8 years. They are legally independent of Sienna's controlling interest status. The debt is real regardless of who holds it. Absorb this. Meaning the credit facilities remain frozen. The covenant default enforcement remains active. The assets securing those defaults remain subject to transfer. She picked up her phone again. What the stay does is prevent the restructuring proposal, the one offering Kwon International the opportunity to repurchase, from being executed while the inheritance is in dispute. The default enforcement can proceed. The mercy cannot. The room held that for a moment. Jae-min sat down at the table, not at the head, in one of the side chairs, the position of someone who is at a table to work rather than to lead. So the stay helps no one except Laszlo, he said. Correct, Rachel said. He didn't file it to protect Kwon International. He filed it to remove Sienna's ability to offer a controlled resolution. He wants chaos. Chaos creates leverage. And if we get Kessel's testimony documented before the court formally reviews the challenge, then we can move to dismiss the challenge on the basis that it's constructed on evidence the primary witness refuses to provide. If it's dismissed, the stay lifts. The restructuring offer goes back on the table. Rachel paused. But dismissal takes time, even with Kessel's cooperation. We're looking at a minimum of 72 hours, more likely a week, before a court moves on it. And in that week, Sienna said, the default enforcement proceeds on its existing timeline. Yes? Jae-min looked at Sienna. What's the existing timeline? Asset transfer documentation was prepared to execute within 10 business days of the meeting today, she said, which was always the plan. The restructuring offer it was the alternative to that timeline. It was what I was prepared to offer instead of the default enforcement. She was looking at him with the directness she'd had since she walked off the elevator this morning. Your mother's action didn't change the enforcement timeline. It removed the alternative. He let that sit. Can the alternative be reinstated? He said, after the challenge is dismissed. Rachel Cho and Sienna exchanged a glance. The specific glance of two people who have discussed a question and reached an answer that one of them now needs to deliver. That would be at Sienna's discretion, Rachel said carefully. Jae-min looked at Sienna. She looked back at him, and in her face was everything the morning had been and everything the 4 years before it had been. And nothing about it was simple or clean or close to resolution, and she was not going to perform simplicity for the sake of the room. I don't know yet, she said. Ask me in a week. They worked through the afternoon. Not together in the sentimental sense, not sitting side by side in a spirit of reconciled purpose. They worked in parallel with a shared urgency that had nothing to do with forgiveness, and everything to do with the specific practical problem that Laszlo represented for both of them. Rachel Cho coordinated with Axiom Crown's broader legal team. Jae-min's retired federal judge, a man named Solomon Park, 76 years old and possessed of a phone manner that suggested he had been expecting someone to call with exactly this kind of problem, agreed to travel to Westport to be present for Howard Kessel's formal statement. Daniel drove. Suhan's man stayed on the property until Daniel arrived. Jae-min handled Thomas Bay at 4 in the afternoon, in a conversation that lasted 22 minutes and ended with Thomas's formal resignation letter drafted and his full cooperation with the forensic documentation process confirmed. Thomas had known it was coming, had known it since Monday, Jae-min suspected, possibly since the March transactions that had started all of this. He signed what needed signing and left the building at 4:45, carrying nothing except his jacket, which he'd forgotten to put on. So he walked to the elevator in his shirt sleeves, holding the jacket in one hand, with the particular deflated quality of a man leaving a room he'd occupied for 9 years for the last time. Jae-min watched him go and felt nothing dramatic, just the specific, subdued weight of a decision that had been delayed longer than it should have been. Choi appeared beside him in the hallway. Mi-suk left the building at 2, he said. She took the car back to Long Island. Did she say anything? She told Garrett that she hoped someone in this organization still had the sense to protect what the family built. He paused. Then she left. Jae-min nodded once. I'll deal with that tonight. At 6:40 in the evening, Sienna's team began packing up the boardroom. The documents went back into their cases in the specific reverse order of their original presentation. Rachel Cho managed this with the systematic attention she brought to everything, while the financial team members communicated in the shorthand of people who have been working alongside each other long enough to move without instruction. Sienna sat at the end of the table until the last of the documents were secured. Then she stood, straightened her jacket, and looked at the room. The long table, the Manhattan skyline through the windows, the specific quality of late afternoon light in a glass-walled room that had been through a great deal since 10 o'clock that morning. She picked up her phone and sent a message to Daniel, who was in Westport and had confirmed 30 minutes earlier that Howard Kessel had given his statement and that Solomon Park had been present for it, and that the documentation was being transmitted to Rachel's team as they spoke. The first piece was in place. The rest would take the time it took. She walked out of the boardroom into the hallway, and Jae-min was there, standing by the window at the end of the corridor with his jacket off and his sleeves still rolled from some time in the afternoon, holding a coffee cup that appeared to have gone cold. He looked at her when she came out. Kessel's statement is filed, she said. I heard. They stood in the hallway. The building was quieter now. The regular staff had filtered out through the late afternoon, and what remained was the specific skeleton of a day that had gone significantly differently from how anyone had planned it. Your mother, Sienna said. She's not going to change. No, he said. You know that. I've known it since I was about 16, he said. It stops mattering after a while. You find a way to account for it. You enabled it. He looked at her. I know. For years, the dismissals, She stopped. Not because she couldn't continue, but because she'd decided something about how much of this particular accounting she was prepared to conduct in a hallway at 6:45 in the evening after the day they'd had. It doesn't need to be said today. It needs to be said sometime. Sometime, she agreed. Not today. He drank the cold coffee, which was the action of a man who needed something to do with his hands and had reached for the nearest available object. He grimaced slightly at the temperature. Set the cup on the windowsill. The Laszlo challenge, he said. Once Kessel's statement is formally before the court, Rachel estimates 10 days for dismissal. Could be faster. And then, she looked at him. He was asking about the restructuring offer, whether it came back, whether the alternative to full default enforcement was still something she was prepared to extend. He was asking it without asking it directly, which was its own kind of answer about what the day had done to the specific pride that had always been the most expensive thing he owned. The 2,000 employees in your legitimate operations, she said, they go home to families tonight not knowing what's happening. They'll go home tomorrow night not knowing. That's been true since Monday, and it will be true until this resolves. I know. I came here today to offer those people stability, she said. That intention hasn't changed because your mother went downstairs. She looked at the window, at the city burning in its evening light. The restructuring offer comes back when the stay lifts. The terms are the same. What Kwon International does with it is Kwon International's decision. He was quiet for a moment. Why, he said. Not why are you being generous. She would have had a sharp answer for that. He said it in a way that meant something more specific. Why, after everything? Why does the offer still stand? Because your mother's choices aren't your employees' choices, she said. And because I didn't build what I built to become the thing I've been fighting. He heard that. She saw him hear it. The small, specific movement of something crossing his face that wasn't performance and wasn't strategy. Just a man receiving a true sentence and knowing it. I'm sorry, he said. 2 words. Not a speech. Not a structured accounting of every failure arranged into a form designed to produce absolution. Just the 2 words, said in the voice of someone who has arrived at them honestly and is not expecting them to fix anything. I know, she said. They stood in the hallway a moment longer. Then Sienna picked up her jacket from where she'd draped it over the windowsill, and she said, I'll have Rachel coordinate with your legal team on the dismissal timeline. And he said, I'll have them available whenever she needs them. And that was how the day ended. Not with a reckoning, not with a resolution, but with a practical sentence exchanged between 2 people who had been through something and were still standing and had work left to do. She walked to the elevator. He watched her go. 10 days later, the inheritance challenge was dismissed. The court's ruling was 3 pages. It found that the challenge lacked evidentiary foundation, that the primary witness, Howard Kessel, had provided sworn testimony contradicting the challenge's central claims, and that the estate documentation executed in the final weeks of Richard Vale Kessler's life was procedurally sound in every particular. Victor Laszlo's attorneys filed a notice of intent to appeal within 6 hours. The notice was their right. It was also, as Rachel Cho noted in a call to Sienna that afternoon, the action of a man trying to make noise in a room where the noise no longer had an audience. He knows he lost, Rachel said. He's been losing since the day Richard changed the will. He just needed to try. Let him appeal, Sienna said. The stay is lifted? As of this morning. Sienna was at her desk in the Axiom Crown offices when the call came. The same desk. The same photograph of her father on the credenza. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did, moving forward with its characteristic indifference to the scale of individual events, enormous and impersonal and, in its way, reliable. She told Rachel to transmit the restructuring offer to Kwon International's legal team. Then she set her phone down and sat in the quiet of her office and thought about her father. Richard Vale Kessler had spent the last weeks of his life methodically correcting the errors he could correct and leaving Sienna with the tools to address the ones he couldn't fix himself. He'd known he was dying. He'd used that knowledge the way he used everything, practically, without sentiment overwhelming function. He'd fired Laszlo, he'd revised the documentation. He'd sat down with Sienna in this office, the one she was sitting in now, and said, in the direct, unornamented way he had of delivering important things, "There are people who will wait for you to make something worth taking. Build it anyway. And know who they are." She had built it. She had not always known who they were in time. She opened her desk drawer and took out the fountain pen. Her father's pen, the one she'd brought back from the estate in her 2 suitcases, the one that had been in her jacket pocket when she sat in that boardroom. She turned it in her fingers. Black barrel, gold nib, the slight weight imbalance that her father had always said he preferred because it made you conscious of the pen in your hand. She placed it on the desk beside her keyboard. Then she went back to work. Jae-min Kwon signed the restructuring acceptance documentation on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after the Thursday that had rearranged everything. He signed it in the Axiom Crown-appointed management office, a space in the Kwon International building that had been established as part of the oversight structure, a room that was technically inside his corporate headquarters and functioned under new authority, which was a detail he had not allowed himself to dwell on, because dwelling on details like that was the kind of thing that made a person useless. He signed every page, clearly, without comment. The Axiom Crown representative across the table, a senior manager named Harrison, who was professionally pleasant and completely unmoved by the historic weight of what he was witnessing, collected the signed pages, confirmed the signatures against the originals, and said, "We'll begin the transition process Monday." And Jae-min said, "My team will be ready." And that was the transaction. Harrison left. Jae-min sat alone in the room. He was 40 years old in 2 months. He had built something that had lasted 16 years and had nearly destroyed itself through the specific arrogance of believing that what he'd built was strong enough to survive anything, including the choices of the people he'd allowed to make choices in his name. He had married a woman he loved and had not loved her sufficiently to pay attention to what he was doing to her. He had let his mother define the walls of his world and had not pushed back until the walls fell. He did not organize these facts into something more flattering. He sat with them. Then he picked up his phone and called Mi-suk. She answered on the second ring. "It's done," he said. Silence from her end. Then, "The signing." "Yes." A longer silence. Mi-suk had spent the past 3 weeks at the Long Island estate. She had not come into the city. She had not called him about the case or the timeline or the legal developments. She had, in the specific way of Mi-suk Kwon, when she was processing a reality that contradicted her expectations, gone quiet. Quiet for Mi-suk was not nothing. It was a great deal. "I behaved badly," she said. He had not expected that sentence. "In the lobby," she said. I acted on what I wanted to be true rather than what the situation required." She paused. "Your father used to say I did that. I always told him he was wrong." "He was right," Jae-min said. "Yes." The word came out slightly compressed, like something she had to push through a narrow space. "He usually was." They were quiet together on the phone for a moment, mother and son, 63 and 36, in a silence that held a great deal of their shared history and some of the damage they'd done to each other in the course of it. "The estate," he said. "It's part of the collateral structure. The transfer timeline is 60 days. "I know." "You'll need to but—" "I know, Jae-min." Not sharply, tiredly. The specific tone of a woman who has been sitting alone in a large house for 3 weeks, thinking about things she'd rather not have had to think about. "I've started looking." He hadn't expected that either. "Good," he said. And then, because it was true, and because he had reached the point in the past 3 weeks where he'd stopped saying things that weren't true simply because they were easier. "I'm sorry about the estate. I know what it meant." Another pause from her end. "It was a house," she said. "It was 30 years, he said. "Yes." A breath. "Yes, it was." They ended the call. He sat in the room alone for another few minutes. Then he stood, straightened his jacket out of habit, and went to the window. Manhattan in the late morning. Traffic on the avenue below, a courier on a bicycle navigating the spaces between cabs, a food cart on the corner with a line of 6 people, the whole impersonal, ordinary machinery of a city that had no particular investment in any of the events of the past 3 weeks. Just the city doing what cities do. Moving. He thought about a painting of a coastline in winter. He thought about a woman looking at it in a crowded room as though the room didn't exist. He thought about what it meant that she had quietly, without announcement, placed hundreds of millions of dollars between him and the collapse of everything he'd built, had done it because she loved him, and had asked for nothing in return except the things she'd already been giving him, herself, present, paying attention. And he had spent 3 years failing to notice that the shelter existed because he'd needed to believe the shelter was his own strength. He turned from the window. He had calls to make. The legitimate businesses were now under transition management, which meant coordination was required, employees to speak to, partners to reassure, operational processes to hand over properly rather than grudgingly. He had decided in the 3 weeks since Thursday that the transition would be executed with the same professionalism that he'd always demanded of everything else. Not because it benefited him strategically, because 2,000 people had done their jobs honestly inside a structure that their leadership had compromised, and they deserved to have the handover handled with the same honesty they'd brought to their work. That was the thing he was keeping, out of everything, the reputation, the properties, the carefully constructed corporate architecture. That was the part he intended to carry forward. The standard. The expectation of quality that he'd built the legitimate businesses on before the other things had gotten inside them. He went back to work. 6 weeks after the restructuring documents were signed, Sienna was walking through the lobby of the Axiom Crown building on her way to a 7 o'clock board meeting when she saw Jae-min through the glass doors. He was outside on the sidewalk. No car waiting, no security, no captain standing at the appropriate distance. Just a man in a dark coat, standing on a Manhattan sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, looking at the building as though he was deciding whether to come in. She pushed through the door. He turned when he heard it open. They looked at each other on the sidewalk outside the building, the city moving behind him, the evening light coming down between the buildings at the specific amber angle of late October. "I wasn't going to come in," he said. He stopped. "I was in the neighborhood," which is a ridiculous thing to say. "It is," she agreed. He looked at her. She looked at him. He had lost weight in the past 2 months, not dramatically, but enough to change the architecture of his face slightly, to bring out the particular quality of bone structure that had always been there underneath the fullness of a man who lived well. He looked less like the Jae-min Kwon whose name appeared in business filings, and more like the man she'd watched look at a painting for 4 uninterrupted minutes. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said in the boardroom, about not becoming the thing you've been fighting." She waited. "I spent 16 years building something that I told myself was about strength," he said. "Control. The ability to exist in a world that doesn't reward weakness." He looked at the sidewalk for a moment, then back at her. "But I think what I actually built was a very elaborate reason not to be afraid." "And now," she said, "now I'm afraid of a considerable number of things," he said. "And it turns out that's not the end of the world." She studied him. The sidewalk. The ordinary October evening around them. "What do you want, Jae-min?" she said. Not unkindly, not as a challenge, as an actual question. He thought about it. Genuinely, visibly thought about it, which was itself something she hadn't seen from him in years. That specific quality of a person arriving at an honest answer rather than a useful one. "To rebuild something," he said. "Smaller, cleaner. Something I can look at without having to account for everything underneath it." He paused. "I talked to someone last week. A business development group working in sustainable construction. Nothing glamorous, not the kind of thing that gets a name in the financial press. A small, dry sound that wasn't quite a laugh. My mother would hate it." "What did you tell them?" "That I'd think about it." "Are you going to?" "Yes," he said. "I think so." They stood on the sidewalk. A cab went by. 2 people walked past them without interest. Because this was Manhattan, and 2 people standing in front of a building having a conversation was not an event worth noting. "I'm not asking to come back," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not standing on this sidewalk to ask you to reconsider anything." "I know," she said. "I'm standing on this sidewalk because—" He stopped. "Found it. Because I wanted you to know that I understand now what you were, what you chose to be inside that marriage, and what it cost you. And I wanted to say that to you directly, not through an attorney, not in a room full of people." He looked at her. Just to you. Sienna looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 4 years. About a house on Long Island Sound and breakfasts in early light, and the small study with its single window, and the way she'd sat there at 4 in the morning doing the specific private math of a marriage that was changing in directions she couldn't arrest. She thought about the painting in the gallery, and the 7 months before the wedding, and the moment she'd decided to place hundreds of millions of dollars between him and disaster, because she could not stand the thought of watching what she loved in him be destroyed by what surrounded him. She thought about her father's pen, about the signature that Jae-min had believed was her surrender. "I know you understand," she said. "I can see that you do." She put her hands in her coat pockets. The evening air was cold now, genuinely cold, the October cold that means the year is turning. "That matters. It doesn't change what I need my life to be. But it matters." He nodded. A single, complete nod. The nod of a man who came for one specific thing and has received it and will not ask for more. "You have a board meeting," he said. 7 o'clock, she said. "I won't keep you." She looked at him one more time. At the man on the sidewalk without his armor, without his captains, without the architecture of a reputation large enough to fill a room. Just a man, middle-aged, standing in the cold air with his hands in his pockets, being honest with someone he had failed to be honest with for years. "Take the construction project," she said. "Build something you can look at." Something moved across his face. "Yeah," he said. "I think I will." She turned and walked back through the doors. The elevator, the 14th floor. The board meeting room where she could see through the glass that 7 people were already seated, and the 8th chair, hers, was waiting. She walked through the door, set her coat over the back of the chair, placed her father's pen on the table beside the agenda document. 7 faces turned toward her. Not with fear. With the specific settled attention of people who have been working alongside someone long enough to trust the direction they're going. She sat down. "All right," she said. "Let's get started." Outside, Manhattan held the last of its evening light for another few minutes before the dark came in, and somewhere on a sidewalk below, a man in a dark coat began walking, and the city moved around him as it moved around everything. Enormous, continuous, indifferent to endings and beginnings alike, making no distinction between the two.